I'm excited to welcome you to my channel. Before I dive into my story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It was one of those serene mornings that made the effort of waking up before dawn entirely worth it. The sky was beginning to glow with the soft colors of sunrise, and the water was calm, gently cradling my boat as I waited patiently with my fishing line cast into the deep. This quiet cove had always been a favorite of mine, a place where I could escape the hustle and bustle of daily life and just lose myself in the peaceful rhythm of nature. As I sat there, my mind drifting with the waves, I felt the familiar tug on my line. It started out gentle, just a slight pull, but it quickly grew stronger. I could tell I had something substantial on the other end. Excitement bubbled up inside me as I began to reel it in, anticipation building with each turn of the handle. Whatever it was putting up quite a fight, and I had to brace myself, leaning back slightly to maintain my balance on the rocking boat. But as I continued to reel in the line, something unexpected happened. The resistance I felt began to shift, becoming more erratic and intense. It wasn't the steady struggle of a fish trying to escape, it was something different, something almost frantic. My excitement started to wane, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. This wasn't the usual catch, and I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. Before I had time to process what was happening, the water around my boat began to stir. What had been a mirror-like surface moments before was now churning, as if disturbed by some unseen force. My heart skipped a beat as I peered over the edge, trying to make sense of the sudden change. Then, out of the depths, I saw them, fish, not just a few, but an entire school, moving together in a way that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. They weren't swimming normally, they were darting and twisting in a chaotic dance, their silver scales flashing in the early morning light. It was almost as if they were in a state of panic, but I couldn't understand why. I had fished in this spot countless times and had never seen anything like it. The sight left me momentarily frozen, my mind racing to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. As the fish moved closer, they began to thrash and splash against the side of the boat. I was taken aback, stepping back instinctively as the water splashed up, drenching my clothes. It was clear that something had spooked them, and in their frenzy, they seemed to be taking it out on anything in their path, including me. One particularly strong fish bumped into my arm, causing me to lose my grip on the reel for a moment. I stumbled but managed to catch myself, my heart now pounding in my chest. I could feel my arm throbbing where the fish had struck, a dull ache that was more surprising than painful. I pulled back my sleeve to check for any damage and saw a small bruise forming, nothing serious but enough to remind me that this was not a normal day of fishing. I sat down on the deck of the boat, my mind whirling as I tried to piece together what had just happened. The school of fish continued their wild dance around the boat, but gradually, they began to calm down, their movements becoming less erratic. I watched as they slowly dispersed, disappearing back into the depths from which they had come. The water stilled once more, and the morning returned to the quiet I had so enjoyed earlier. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. What could have caused such a reaction from the fish? I had no answers, only a lingering sense of bewilderment. The peaceful morning I had hoped for had turned into something entirely unexpected, leaving me with more questions than answers. I spent the next few minutes just sitting there, staring out at the water, reflecting on the strange turn of events. I'd always considered fishing to be a calming, almost meditative activity, but today had shown me that even in the most familiar of places, the unexpected could happen. I knew I'd be thinking about this moment for a long time, pondering what might have spooked those fish so badly. As I finally packed up my gear and prepared to head back to shore, I couldn't help but feel a little more connected to the world around me, reminded of the mysteries that nature still holds. It was a humbling experience, one that left me with a newfound respect for the creatures I so often sought to catch. And as I motored away, I knew that the next time I came back to this cove, I'd be a little more cautious, a little more aware that even in the most peaceful of places, there's always the possibility for surprise. In the hours after the attack, the pain in my arm didn't just linger, it seemed to grow, pulsing in time with my heartbeat, a constant reminder of what had happened. But more than the physical pain, it was the shock of the incident that gnawed at me. The peaceful morning I'd set out to enjoy had been shattered in a way that was both confusing and infuriating. As I sat alone in my small, empty house later that day, the anger began to creep in, slow and steady, until it was all I could think about. It wasn't just the physical injury that bothered me, though that was bad enough. It was the way the whole event had felt, like an affront, a violation of the tranquility I'd come to expect on the water. Fishing was supposed to be my escape, my way of connecting with nature, and yet here I was, nursing a wound and feeling as if something had been taken from me. The more I dwelled on it, the more that anger twisted into something darker, something that demanded a response. My mind started to wander to thoughts of getting back at those fish, of showing them, somehow, that they couldn't just turn on me like that and get away with it. At first, it seemed absurd, the idea of seeking revenge on a school of fish, but as the day wore on, it became less of a joke and more of a plan. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense in my angry, wounded state. They had attacked me, after all, unprovoked, and left me with this pain. I wanted them to feel it too. That's when the idea hit me, explosives. It was drastic, sure, but it seemed fitting in the heat of the moment. If I could stun them, just for a second, maybe I could send a message, show them that they couldn't mess with me. I wasn't thinking clearly, that much was obvious now, but in the thick of it, all I could see was red. My thoughts spiraled around this plan, convincing myself that it was justified, that I had every right to defend myself, even if the threat was long gone. I told myself it wasn't just about the attack, it was about restoring balance, reclaiming that sense of peace that had been so violently disturbed. I knew where they were, where they'd come from, and in my mind, it felt almost like justice to go back there and make them pay. I knew it wasn't logical, but at the time, it didn't need to be. It was about satisfying that deep, burning anger that had taken root inside me. I even started to rationalize it further, convincing myself that this was just an extension of what fishermen do, control the waters, manage the population. Maybe I was preventing future incidents, I thought, protecting others from what I'd gone through. The more I repeated these ideas, the more they made sense, and the anger within me found an outlet in this irrational plan. Of course, deep down, there was a part of me that knew it was wrong, that what I was planning wasn't just an overreaction, it was dangerous and irresponsible. But that voice was small, drowned out by the louder, more immediate desire for action. In those moments, it wasn't about right or wrong, it was about doing something, anything, to make the pain and the humiliation go away. So, I set about gathering what I thought I'd need, my mind focused on nothing but this misguided plan. The more I prepared, the more real it all became, and that sense of power, of taking control, started to eclipse the fear and confusion I'd felt on the boat. It was a dangerous line of thinking, but I was too caught up in it to see that. I told myself I was ready, that I had everything I needed to make those fish pay for what they'd done. In the back of my mind, there was a nagging doubt, a small voice that questioned what I was doing, but I pushed it aside. The anger, the need for revenge, was too strong. I convinced myself that I had to do this, that it was the only way to find peace again. And with that, I set out, ready to carry out my impulsive plan, blind to the reality of what I was about to do. The day I chose to carry out my plan was eerily similar to the one when I was first attacked. The sky was clear, the water calm, and the early morning light cast a golden hue over everything. It was almost as if nature was taunting me, reminding me of the peace I had lost. But this time, I wasn't out there to fish. I had a different mission in mind, one fueled by the simmering anger that had been boiling inside me ever since that fateful day. I'd spent the night before convincing myself that what I was about to do was justified. I'd gone over every detail in my head, assuring myself that this was the right thing to do. As I approached the spot where the attack had happened, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anticipation, anxiety, and a twisted sense of satisfaction. I was finally going to make things right, or so I thought. I anchored the boat and started to prepare the explosives, my hands moving automatically, guided by the intense focus that had taken over me. My mind was so wrapped up in the task at hand that I barely noticed the sound of a distant engine, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't until the sound became impossible to ignore that I looked up, my heart skipping a beat as I saw a police boat speeding toward me. Panic surged through me, a cold wave that washed over the anger I had been clinging to. This wasn't part of the plan. How could they have known? My mind raced, trying to figure out how they had found me, how they had even known what I was about to do. I hadn't told anyone, hadn't given any indication of my intentions, and yet here they were, closing in on me. Before I could react, the police boat was alongside mine, and officers were shouting orders. The words barely registered as my mind struggled to catch up with the sudden turn of events. My plan, the one I had been so sure of, was unraveling before my eyes. The confusion was overwhelming, leaving me standing there, frozen, as they boarded my boat. The officers quickly took control of the situation, one of them moving to disarm the explosives while another approached me, placing me under arrest. The frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over. How could this be happening? I hadn't even had a chance to act, and yet here I was, being treated like a criminal. My mind raced with indignation, but I couldn't find the words to express it. As they handcuffed me and read me my rights, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, humiliation, and a deep, gnawing frustration. I wanted to explain myself, to tell them why I was doing this, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. In their eyes, I was just another person breaking the law, another case to process. The officers didn't care about my reasons or my pain. All they saw was the danger I had created, the recklessness of my actions. As I was led to the police boat, the reality of what I had done, and what I had almost done, began to sink in. The anger that had driven me was now replaced by a heavy sense of regret. I'd been so consumed by my need for revenge that I hadn't stopped to consider the consequences, and now I was paying the price. The ride back to shore was a blur, the sound of the engine drowning out my thoughts. I couldn't believe how quickly things had spiraled out of control, how my plan had been thwarted before it had even begun. The frustration gnawed at me, but there was nothing I could do. The police had intervened, stopping me before I could make a mistake that would have changed my life forever. As we reached the shore and I was led away, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of defeat. My plan, my revenge, had amounted to nothing more than a foolish, dangerous impulse. The frustration still lingered, but now it was mixed with the harsh reality that I had no one to blame but myself. The police had arrived just in time, not just to arrest me, but to stop me from doing something I would have regretted for the rest of my life. As the police escorted me back to shore, my mind was still spinning, trying to make sense of how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. I was angry, frustrated, and more than a little confused. My plan, the one I'd convinced myself was foolproof, had unraveled in a matter of minutes, and I had no idea why the police had shown up at that exact moment. It felt like some cruel twist of fate, and I couldn't help but wonder what had tipped them off. Once we reached the shore, they led me into a small, nondescript building not far from the docks. It looked like an ordinary office from the outside, but the seriousness of the officers' faces told me this was more than just a routine stop. They sat me down in a stark room, the kind you see in movies, with a single table and a few chairs. I couldn't shake the feeling of being in way over my head. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers, a stern-looking man with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, sat down across from me. He looked at me for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if he was sizing me up, trying to decide how much trouble I was really in. "Do you know where you were fishing?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge that made it clear he wasn't just making small talk. I hesitated, not sure what he was getting at. "Yeah, I've been fishing there for years," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's a good spot, lots of fish." He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. "Do you know what's near that spot?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. His question caught me off guard. "Near that spot?" "Just more water, I guess." "What's this about?" The officer's expression didn't change as he reached into a folder and pulled out a map, sliding it across the table toward me. "Take a look," he said, pointing to a marked area. I glanced down at the map, recognizing the cove where I'd been fishing. But then my eyes drifted to the area just a little further out, and I felt my stomach drop. There, clearly marked, was a restricted zone, a large swath of water labeled as a military facility. It wasn't just off limits, it was a place I had no business being anywhere near. "That's right next to where you were fishing," the officer said, his voice cutting through my shock. "That entire area is under strict control by the military. Fishing there, or even being in that area without authorization, is a serious violation." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd had no idea, none at all, that I was so close to a restricted zone. I'd been fishing in that cove for years, completely oblivious to the fact that I was just a stone's throw away from something so heavily guarded. It had always seemed like the perfect spot, secluded, quiet, full of fish, but now I understood why it had always felt so untouched. No one else fished there because they weren't allowed to. I didn't know, I stammered, my mind reeling from the revelation. "I swear, I had no idea it was a restricted area." The officer's face softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "That may be true, but ignorance doesn't excuse the violation. You were too close to a highly sensitive military site, and that's why we responded so quickly. We can't take any chances with security in that area." As he spoke, the full weight of the situation began to sink in. I had unknowingly broken the law, putting myself at risk of far more than just a ruined fishing trip. My impulsive plan for revenge, reckless as it was, could have landed me in even deeper trouble if the police hadn't intervened when they did. Sitting there in that stark room, I felt a sinking feeling of regret wash over me. Not just for the illegal act I had almost committed, but for the sheer stupidity of my actions. I'd let my anger blind me, and now I was facing the consequences. The peaceful spot I'd always loved wasn't just another fishing hole, it was a forbidden zone, protected for reasons I couldn't even begin to understand. The officer continued to explain the gravity of the situation, but his words barely registered. All I could think about was how close I had come to making an even bigger mistake. What had started as a simple fishing trip had turned into a legal nightmare, all because I hadn't paid attention to where I was or what I was doing. The realization that I had been fishing in a forbidden area was bad enough, but knowing I had almost crossed an even more dangerous line left me feeling utterly defeated. After the officer laid out the reality of my situation, I was left sitting in that cold, sterile room, my mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. The adrenaline that had fueled me throughout the day was finally wearing off, leaving behind a gnawing sense of dread that seemed to settle deep in my gut. But there was something else too, something more immediate, the sharp, throbbing pain in my arm that I'd all but forgotten about in the chaos of the arrest. One of the officers, a younger guy with a serious expression, noticed the way I was cradling my arm and stepped forward. "We need to get that looked at," he said, his tone softer than before. He gestured for me to follow him, and I reluctantly got to my feet, the pain intensifying as I moved. He led me to a small, makeshift first aid station set up in the corner of the building. It wasn't much, just a cot, a few medical supplies, and a tired-looking medic who seemed more accustomed to dealing with minor scrapes and bruises than anything serious. Still, they treated me with surprising care, guiding me to sit down on the cot as they gathered their supplies. The medic took one look at my arm and frowned. "You've got a pretty nasty bruise here," he said, as he gently rolled up my sleeve to get a better look. The skin was swollen and discolored, a deep purple that spread across my forearm like a dark cloud. I winced as he pressed lightly around the area, checking for any deeper injury. As he worked, cleaning the wound and wrapping it in gauze, I couldn't help but focus on the contrast between the pain in my arm and the deeper, more unsettling dread that was building in the back of my mind. The physical pain was sharp and immediate, something I could see and feel, something tangible that could be bandaged and treated. But the dread, well, that was something different. It was a cold, creeping sensation that gnawed at me from the inside, a realization that my problems were far from over. The medic worked quickly, his hands steady and practiced, but my thoughts were far from the small, stinging cuts and the throbbing in my arm. I kept replaying the events of the day over and over in my mind, the attack by the fish, my impulsive plan for revenge, the sudden arrival of the police, and the revelation that I had been fishing in a restricted area. It all felt like a bad dream, something that couldn't possibly be real, yet here I was, sitting in a police station with my arm bandaged and my future uncertain. As the medic finished up, securing the bandage with a few last pieces of tape, he gave me a sympathetic look. "You should be okay, but you'll want to keep an eye on it. If the swelling doesn't go down or if the pain gets worse, you'll need to see a doctor." I nodded numbly, barely hearing his words. The pain in my arm, though significant, was nothing compared to the anxiety churning in my stomach. What was going to happen next? Would I be charged? Fined? Jailed? The possibilities seemed endless, and none of them were good. I had gotten myself into a mess far bigger than I had anticipated, and there was no easy way out. The officer who had led me to the first aid station reappeared as the medic finished up. "You're done here," he said, motioning for me to stand. "Let's get you back to the holding area." As I stood up, the dull throb in my arm pulsed with every heartbeat, but it was the growing sense of dread that truly weighed me down. With each step I took, I could feel the walls closing in, the reality of my situation sinking deeper and deeper. I wasn't just dealing with a physical injury, I was facing the consequences of my actions, and there was no bandage that could fix that. They led me back to the small, stark room where I had been before, and I sat down, staring at my bandaged arm. The pain was a constant reminder of the day's events, but it was nothing compared to the fear of what was to come. The dread that had been slowly building inside me was now almost overwhelming, as I waited, alone with my thoughts, wondering what would happen next and how I would ever get out of the mess I had created. After the medic had finished tending to my arm and I was led back to the holding room, the gravity of my situation started to press down on me like a weight I couldn't shrug off. The dull ache in my arm was nothing compared to the anxiety gnawing at me, but I tried to keep it together, hoping against hope that this was all some big misunderstanding that could be cleared up quickly. But when the door opened again, and the officer with the graying hair stepped back into the room, I could tell from his expression that things were about to get much more serious. He carried a small stack of papers in one hand, and his demeanor was all business as he sat down across from me. "All right," he began, his voice steady and calm, but with an edge that told me he wasn't here to offer any leniency. "We're going to go through the formal arrest process now. I need you to listen carefully and understand the charges being brought against you." I swallowed hard, nodding, though my throat felt dry as sandpaper. He started explaining, reading from the paperwork in his hand. "You are being formally charged with fishing in a restricted area, dangerously close to a military facility. This is a serious violation of both federal and local laws. Additionally, you were found in possession of illegal explosives with the intent to use them in a manner that could have resulted in significant harm to the environment and potentially endangered lives." Each word hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known I was in trouble, but hearing it laid out like that, cold, factual, and legal, made it all too real. This wasn't just about a bad day on the water or some impulsive, ill-conceived plan for revenge. This was about breaking the law, about crossing lines I hadn't even known were there. As the officer went on, explaining my rights and the potential consequences of my actions, I felt a growing sense of dread. This was no longer just about me and my reckless anger. This was about legal repercussions, criminal charges, and the very real possibility of a future tainted by a moment of sheer stupidity. "We'll also be issuing you a 6-month ban on all fishing activities, effective immediately," the officer continued, his tone unwavering. "This ban applies not only to the area where you were caught, but extends to all public and private fishing spots within this jurisdiction. Any violation of this ban will result in further legal action." He placed a document in front of me, pointing to the bottom of the page. "I need you to sign here to acknowledge that you understand the charges and the terms of the ban." I stared at the paper, my mind swimming with everything that had just been said. 6 months. No fishing. The one thing I had always turned to for peace, for a sense of purpose and connection, was being taken away from me. It wasn't just a hobby or a pastime, it was a part of who I was. And now, because of one reckless decision, it was gone, at least for the foreseeable future. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the pen, the reality of what I had done settling in with a heavy finality. As I scrawled my name on the dotted line, I couldn't help but think about how everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. Just a few days ago, I had been living my life, going about my routine, and now here I was, signing away my right to fish, facing legal charges, and wondering how I had let things get this bad. After I handed the signed document back to the officer, he gave me a brief nod, then stood to leave. "You'll be released shortly, but you'll need to appear in court on the date specified in this paperwork. Make sure you don't miss it." With that, he left me alone in the room again, the door closing behind him with a heavy, final sound. I sat there, staring at the table, my thoughts a tangled mess of regret, anger at myself, and a deep, gnawing sense of fear for what was to come. The seriousness of my situation was sinking in, deeper with each passing minute. I'd always prided myself on being a simple man, someone who lived a quiet life, kept to himself, and didn't cause trouble. But now, because of a moment of foolishness, everything had changed. The fishing ban was just the beginning. I knew there were legal battles ahead, consequences I hadn't even fully wrapped my head around yet. As I sat there, the weight of my actions pressing down on me, I realized that this wasn't something I could just brush off or ignore. It wasn't going to go away with time. I was going to have to face it head on, deal with the consequences, and somehow find a way to move forward from the mess I had created. The first few weeks of the fishing ban were some of the longest of my life. The days dragged on, each one feeling emptier than the last. I had always started my mornings early, heading out to the water before the sun was fully up, but now, those mornings stretched out in front of me like an endless void. Without fishing, I felt like a part of me was missing, and I couldn't help but dwell on how I had ended up in this situation. At first, my thoughts were a jumble of frustration and regret. I replayed the events over and over in my mind, as if trying to find some way to undo them. If only I hadn't been so impulsive, if only I had taken a step back and thought things through, maybe I wouldn't be sitting here, with nothing to do but stare at the walls and wait for the ban to end. But every time I tried to rationalize what had happened, I came up against the same hard truth. I had let my anger get the best of me, and now I was paying the price. It wasn't long before the frustration began to give way to deeper reflection. As the days went by, I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about why I had done it. I'd always considered myself a rational man, someone who didn't let his emotions dictate his actions. But in that moment, when the fish had attacked me and my anger had flared up, all of that had gone out the window. I had acted on impulse, driven by a need for revenge that I hadn't even known I was capable of. Sitting alone in my house, with nothing but my thoughts for company, I began to question that desire for revenge. What had I been thinking? What had I hoped to accomplish? The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like such a foolish, pointless thing to do. I had wanted to hurt those fish, to make them pay for the pain they had caused me, but in the end, all I had done was hurt myself. I had lost my freedom to fish, put myself in legal trouble, and damaged the one thing that had always brought me peace. I started to see just how narrow my thinking had been in those moments. The world had seemed so small, so focused on that single act of retaliation, that I hadn't considered the bigger picture. I hadn't thought about the consequences, about how my actions would affect my life or the lives of those around me. I had been so wrapped up in my own anger that I had blinded myself to everything else. As the weeks went on, that realization grew sharper, cutting through the lingering frustration and leaving behind a deep sense of regret. I couldn't believe how close I had come to doing something that could have had even worse consequences. The ban was bad enough, but what if the police hadn't shown up when they did? What if I had gone through with my plan and caused real harm? The thought made my stomach churn, a cold knot of dread settling in my chest. The more I reflected, the more I saw just how much I had lost in that moment of impulsiveness. Fishing wasn't just a hobby for me, it was a part of who I was, a way to connect with the world and find a sense of calm in an otherwise chaotic life. But in my anger, I had been willing to throw all of that away for a chance to get back at a school of fish. It seemed so absurd, so out of character, that I could hardly believe it had been me who had done it. With each passing day, the seriousness of my mistake weighed heavier on me. I couldn't change what had happened, but I knew I had to learn from it, had to find a way to make sure something like this never happened again. I had to let go of that anger, that need for revenge, and focus on what really mattered. Maybe that was the lesson I needed to learn, the importance of thinking before acting, of considering the consequences before letting my emotions take the lead. As I sat there, day after day, with no fishing to distract me, I realized that this ban was more than just a punishment. It was a chance to reflect, to take stock of what I had done and figure out how to move forward. The anger that had driven me in those moments now seemed so small, so insignificant compared to the bigger picture of my life. And though it was hard, though it felt like I had lost a part of myself, I knew that this time of reflection was necessary. In the quiet of those long, empty days, I began to understand that revenge had never been the answer. It had only led me down a path of destruction, one that had cost me more than I had ever imagined. And as the weeks stretched on, I resolved to come out of this ban a better man, one who thought before he acted, who valued peace over conflict, and who understood that some things just aren't worth the price you pay for them. As the weeks turned into months, the initial storm of regret that had consumed me began to slowly subside. The pain of what I'd lost still lingered, but it no longer gnawed at me with the same intensity. Instead, it transformed into something more reflective, a kind of quiet determination to make things right once the ban was finally lifted. At first, my thoughts were still clouded with what-ifs and could-have-beens. I spent countless hours replaying the events that led to my arrest, analyzing every decision, every mistake. But as time passed, I began to accept that dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything. What was done was done. The important thing now was to figure out how I could move forward, how I could approach the future with a clearer head and a better understanding of myself. The ban was a constant reminder of the consequences of my actions, but rather than letting it paralyze me with regret, I started to see it as an opportunity. I couldn't fish for the time being, but that didn't mean I couldn't prepare for the day when I could return to the water. Slowly, my thoughts shifted from regret to planning, from what I shouldn't have done to what I would do differently. I began by thinking about how I had always approached fishing before the incident. It had been a solitary activity, something I did for peace and quiet, to escape from the stresses of daily life. But in the weeks of reflection, I realized that my approach had also been somewhat careless. I hadn't paid enough attention to my surroundings, to the rules and regulations that were in place for a reason. I'd been so focused on the act of fishing itself that I hadn't considered the bigger picture. So, I started making a plan. I would learn from my mistakes and become more mindful of where and how I fished. The first step would be to educate myself fully about the areas where I liked to fish. I'd research the local laws, find out which spots were restricted, and make sure I was always on the right side of the regulations. No more taking things for granted or assuming that just because I'd fished somewhere before, it was still okay to do so. I also thought about the anger that had driven me to make such a reckless decision. I couldn't allow myself to be ruled by emotions like that again. If I ever felt that same surge of frustration, I'd have to step back and take a breath to remind myself of the consequences of letting anger guide my actions. Fishing was supposed to be a peaceful activity, a way to connect with nature, not a battleground for my frustrations. In addition to planning how I would approach fishing differently, I also began to think about how I could use this time to improve my skills and knowledge. Since I couldn't be out on the water, I started reading up on different techniques, learning about the habits of various fish species, and even experimenting with tying my own flies and lures. I wanted to be better prepared for when I could finally return to the water, to make sure that when the ban was lifted, I would come back as a more thoughtful, skilled, and responsible fisherman. The idea of sharing my passion with others also crossed my mind. Maybe, once I was allowed to fish again, I could teach others about the importance of respecting the environment and the rules that protect it. I'd always fished alone, but perhaps there was value in connecting with a community and sharing what I'd learned from my mistakes and helping others avoid the same pitfalls. As the end of the ban began to approach, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected: hope. I had spent so much time beating myself up over what had happened, but now I was looking ahead, eager to get back to the water with a new perspective. I was no longer the same person who had recklessly tried to take revenge on a school of fish. I had grown, learned, and changed. And when I returned to fishing, it would be with a deeper respect for the sport, for the environment, and for the rules that governed both. I knew there would be challenges ahead, that it wouldn't be easy to let go of the guilt completely, but I was ready to face those challenges head on. The time away from the water had given me a chance to reflect, to plan, and to prepare. Now, all that was left was to wait for the day when I could finally put those plans into action and prove to myself that I had truly learned from my mistakes. About halfway through the ban, when the days had begun to blend together and I was getting restless, I decided to take a walk along the shoreline near where I used to fish. I wasn't sure why I chose that particular day or that specific spot. Maybe it was a mix of nostalgia and curiosity, a need to reconnect with the place that had once been my sanctuary. I hadn't intended to get close to the area the police had warned me about, but as I walked, lost in thought, my feet seemed to carry me there of their own accord. The shoreline was as quiet as ever, the kind of quiet that used to bring me peace, but now felt tinged with something else, an unease that had settled deep inside me since the incident. The water lapped gently at the rocks, and a few seagulls circled overhead, their calls echoing in the still air. It all seemed so normal, so familiar, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I continued walking, the path winding closer to the area the police had mentioned, though I didn't realize it at first. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the events that had led to my arrest and the weeks of reflection that had followed. But then I noticed something, a change in the landscape, subtle but unmistakable. The trees grew denser here, their branches forming a canopy that cast the ground in shadow. The trail, once well-trodden, became rougher, less defined, as if fewer people had passed this way. And then, almost without warning, I found myself at the edge of a clearing. My heart skipped a beat as I realized where I was. This was it, the restricted area, the one the officer had warned me about. Just beyond the trees, partially hidden from view, was the military facility. Curiosity tugged at me, a mix of fear and fascination that I couldn't ignore. I stepped closer, careful not to make too much noise, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't like anyone could see me from where I was standing. The facility itself was mostly obscured by the trees, but I could make out bits and pieces through the gaps in the foliage, tall fences topped with barbed wire, a few squat buildings painted in drab, nondescript colors, and what looked like a guard tower in the distance. The place was eerily quiet, almost too quiet, and that only added to the sense of unease that had been building within me. There was no movement, no sign of life, but I knew better than to assume the place was deserted. It was a military facility, after all, and even though I couldn't see anyone, I could feel the presence of watchful eyes, hidden cameras, and silent alarms just waiting to be triggered. I stood there for a few minutes, taking it all in, my mind racing with questions. What exactly was going on in there? Why was this area so heavily guarded? The police had said it was a restricted zone, but they hadn't given me any details, and now that I was here, I couldn't help but wonder. The facility had an air of secrecy about it, a sense of danger that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This was no ordinary outpost, it was something more, something I had unknowingly trespassed near during my fishing trips. As I stood there, the memory of that day on the water came rushing back, the panic, the confusion, the anger that had driven me to act so recklessly. Suddenly, it all made sense. The fish, the police, the swift response to my presence in the area, it was all connected. I had stumbled too close to something I wasn't supposed to see, and the consequences had been swift and severe. The longer I stood there, the more the sense of danger grew. I knew I shouldn't be here, that I was risking more than just my curiosity by lingering so close to the facility. But I couldn't help myself. The mystery of the place tugged at me, a reminder of how little I had known about the waters I'd been fishing in for years. Eventually, the weight of that danger became too much to ignore. I forced myself to turn away, to retrace my steps back to the safety of the well-worn trail. But as I walked, the image of the facility lingered in my mind, a stark reminder of how close I had come to real trouble. It added a new layer to the way I thought about fishing in that area, a sense of respect, yes, but also a deep wariness. This was no longer just a quiet cove where I could cast my line and lose myself in the rhythm of the waves. It was a place of secrets, of hidden dangers that I hadn't fully understood until now. As I left the area behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed for good. The sense of innocence I'd once associated with fishing there was gone, replaced by the knowledge that I had been playing with fire, completely unaware of the risks. And though I didn't plan to return to that spot anytime soon, the memory of the facility, and the danger it represented, would stay with me, a constant reminder to be more mindful of where I cast my line in the future. The day the 6-month ban finally ended dawned just like any other, but for me, it felt like the start of something new. I woke up early, as I had so many times before, but this morning carried a different weight, a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. It was a day I'd been counting down to for what felt like an eternity, and now that it had arrived, I wasn't sure what to make of it. The ban had hung over me like a dark cloud, a constant reminder of my mistakes and the consequences that followed. But as the days and weeks had passed, it had also given me something I hadn't expected: time to reflect, to think, and to grow. The person I was when the ban was imposed was not the same person who stood by the window that morning, staring out at the world with a new sense of purpose. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my hands as I thought about everything that had happened. The anger that had driven me to such reckless actions was long gone, replaced by a quiet resolve to do better, to be better. The fishing ban had forced me to confront parts of myself I hadn't fully understood: the impulsiveness, the short temper, the need to lash out when things didn't go my way. I'd spent so much time regretting my actions, but in the end, that regret had led me to a deeper understanding of who I was and who I wanted to be. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about what I had learned over the past 6 months. Patience, for one thing. The ban had been a harsh lesson in waiting and accepting that some things take time to heal, both physically and mentally. I'd also learned the value of mindfulness, of being aware of my surroundings and the consequences of my actions. I had let my emotions get the better of me that day on the water, and it had cost me dearly. But now, I knew better. I knew the importance of thinking things through, of considering the bigger picture before acting on impulse. And then there was the lesson of respect for the rules, for the environment, and for the boundaries that existed for a reason. I had always seen fishing as a simple pleasure, a way to escape and unwind, but I had taken for granted the responsibility that came with it. The ban had forced me to recognize that fishing wasn't just about casting a line and reeling in a catch. It was about understanding and respecting the world I was interacting with. With all these thoughts swirling in my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if I was ready to return to fishing. It had been such a central part of my life for so long, but now, after everything that had happened, I wasn't sure if I could go back to it the way I had before. The old routines, the familiar spots, they all felt different now, colored by the experiences of the past 6 months. I finished my coffee and set the mug down, standing up to look out the window. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the landscape. The water, so familiar and yet so changed in my mind, called to me in a way it hadn't in a long time. But this time, it wasn't just about fishing. It was about something deeper, a connection to the world that I had come to appreciate more fully during my time away. I knew I would go back to fishing eventually, but not today. Today was about something else. It was about acknowledging the changes I had undergone and figuring out how to move forward in a way that honored those changes. I wasn't the same person who had recklessly tried to take revenge on a school of fish. I was someone who had learned the value of patience, of reflection, and of careful, thoughtful action. Instead of grabbing my fishing gear, I decided to take a walk along the shore, just to be near the water, to feel its presence without the pressure of catching anything. As I walked, I let my thoughts drift, considering how I could approach fishing differently in the future, how I could make it less about the catch and more about the experience, about the connection to nature that had always drawn me to it in the first place. The day the ban ended wasn't a day of triumph or celebration. It was a day of quiet reflection, of acknowledging the lessons learned and the changes made. I knew that when I did return to fishing, it would be with a new mindset, a deeper respect for the water and the life it held. But for now, I was content to walk along the shore, taking in the beauty of the world around me and feeling, for the first time in a long time, truly at peace with myself and my place in it. I had something else in mind now, something beyond just fishing. It was about living with intention, about making choices that aligned with the person I wanted to be. And as I walked, I realized that the end of the ban wasn't just the end of a restriction, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one that I was ready to embrace with open arms. This is where the story ends. Share your opinion in the comments. Did you like the story?